a decorated federal agent, badge clipped to her blazer, federal credentials in her left hand, extended and visible. Grabbed by the shoulder by an officer who looked directly at those credentials and chose, consciously, deliberately, not to read them. Not a suspect, not a criminal. A woman who had spent 9 years hunting the kind of people that kept officers like Brandon Brown employed. 6 hours later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation walked through the front doors of the Callaway County Police Department. And when they left, 17 men and women handed over their badges and never came back. One department was dismantled. One county bankrupted. One officer who believed no one was watching, proven catastrophically wrong. This is the story of Special Agent Barbara Ross. And it is every bit as consequential as it sounds. The night of September 9th felt like most nights in Callaway County, Georgia. The kind of Wednesday that vanishes into the week without a mark. The air carried the particular stillness that comes just before autumn, warm enough to leave windows cracked, quiet enough to hear a freight train 2 miles off on the Route 7 rail line. The streets near the Garrison Road corridor were empty, interrupted only by the occasional flicker of a gas station canopy and the slow crawl of a delivery truck making its last run south. Special Agent Barbara Ross had been awake for 19 hours. She sat in a rented gray Honda Accord, chosen because it was invisible, because it looked exactly like every other car a college student or a night shift nurse might drive through a neighborhood like this at 1 a.m. Her phone rested face down on her thigh, screen dark. On the seat beside her, a half-finished bottle of water, a worn spiral notebook, and a manila case folder stamped in bold red letters, Operation Steelgate, Restricted Access. Barbara was 34 years old, a graduate of Spelman College and the FBI Academy at Quantico, a 9-year veteran of the Bureau's Southeast Field Division who had built her entire career in the quiet, unglamorous architecture of undercover work, the kind that never made headlines because the cases it produced were airtight before they ever reached a courtroom. She had dismantled a fentanyl distribution network running through Macon and Augusta. She had placed 3 members of the Harlan Trafficking Consortium in federal custody using evidence she alone had gathered over 11 months. She had testified before federal grand juries without a single case overturned. Tonight, she was 4 days from closing the most significant operation of her career. The Dalton Network, a loosely structured but deeply embedded trafficking and narcotics operation spanning 4 Georgia counties, had been under FBI surveillance for 16 months. Barbara had spent the last 5 of those months constructing a cover identity as a logistics broker, working her way into the trust of a mid-level courier named Terrence Galt, a man who moved both product and people through a chain of legitimate-looking freight businesses operating out of the Garrison Road industrial strip. The federal warrant that would dismantle the entire network was 72 hours from being signed. What Barbara needed tonight was one confirmation. A secondary staging location, believed to be somewhere in the Garrison Road complex, where the network held its most vulnerable cargo before transfer. She was alone in the car because the protocol demanded it. No visible backup. No marked presence. Nothing to alter the environment she had spent 5 months carefully arranging. At 12:51 a.m., a Callaway County Patrol cruiser turned slowly onto Garrison Road. Barbara saw it and did not move. Patrol cars came through here. It was a commercial district. It was expected. She kept her eyes on the loading dock of a freight warehouse 200 feet ahead and rested one hand flat on her knee. The cruiser slowed, then stopped. Then its spotlight fired on, filling the interior of the Accord with hard white light. Barbara exhaled through her nose. Long, controlled, deliberate. She knew exactly what this looked like. She had been in this position before. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she was a black woman alone in a car in an industrial district past midnight, and she had learned through years of professional discipline that the safest thing to do in this moment was to move slowly, speak first, and give the officer every possible opportunity to make the right choice. She placed both hands on the steering wheel. Visible. Still. Officer Brandon Brown stepped out of the patrol cruiser. He was 31 years old, 6 years on the force. He had a broad, settled build and the particular walk of a man who had confused confidence with certainty for so long that the distinction no longer occurred to him. Behind him, his partner, Officer Dale Merritt, exited the passenger side and moved to position himself at the rear of the Accord. Brown approached the driver's window with one hand resting on his belt. "Ma'am, roll down the window. Step out of the vehicle." Barbara rolled down the window. She did not step out. Instead, calmly and without hesitation, she spoke first. "Officer, I need to let you know that I am a federal law enforcement agent. I'm going to reach into my jacket and present my credentials. Please don't be alarmed." A pause. Brown's expression didn't shift toward caution. It shifted toward something else, the flat, closed look of a man who has already made his assessment and found the incoming information inconvenient. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now. I am Special Agent Barbara Ross with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am on an active undercover surveillance operation. Before this goes any further, I need you to contact your supervisor. This situation can be resolved in 60 seconds. Brown glanced back at Merritt. Something moved between them, not uncertainty, not recalibration. The specific, wordless agreement of two people who have decided they do not need to reconsider. Out of the car. Last time. "I'm reaching for my credentials now." Brown put his hand on the door handle. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Barbara Ross was removed from the Accord with her hands raised, her FBI badge and federal credentials in plain sight, still speaking in the level, precise tone of a woman who understood that everything happening right now was being cataloged for later. "I am a federal agent. Badge number. Stop talking. Hands behind your back. My supervising agent is Marcus Webb. His direct line is, 'You're making this worse for yourself. Hands. What is the charge? What am I being detained for?' No one answered that question. Not at that moment. Not for the next 40 minutes. Officer Merritt reached into the passenger window and retrieved the Operation Steelgate folder from the seat. He held it up, the red restricted access stamp catching the spotlight, and turned it toward Brown. A reasonable officer at that moment would have felt something shift. Would have said, "Wait, let's think about this carefully." Officer Brandon Brown was not, at that moment, a reasonable officer. "Could be anything," he said. "Book her." Barbara Ross was handcuffed and placed in the back of the patrol cruiser. Her phone, her only direct line to the FBI field office, was dropped into an evidence bag. Her badge, her credentials, her surveillance file, all of it sealed, tagged, and locked in a patrol trunk. The charges that eventually appeared on the intake form at Callaway County PD read: suspicious activity, failure to comply, loitering in a restricted commercial zone. The Garrison Road corridor was not a restricted commercial zone. There was no ordinance designating it as such. There had never been one. Sergeant Kevin Price was the watch supervisor on duty that night, a man 3 years from retirement who had long since stopped asking questions that might complicate a quiet shift. When Brown radioed in the arrest, Price asked exactly 2 questions. "Does she have a weapon?" "Yes." "Standard Bureau sidearm, service issued." "Is she in custody?" "Yes." He approved the booking without asking about the badge, without asking about the federal credentials, without asking about the restricted access case file that was now sitting in an evidence bag in his facility. At 1:07 a.m., Special Agent Barbara Ross was processed into the Callaway County Detention Facility. At 1:09 a.m., she was placed in Holding Cell 7. At 1:11 a.m., Officer Merritt returned to the Accord, removed the FBI field beacon magnetically attached beneath the rear bumper, and, according to his later written statement, placed it in the vehicle's center console for safekeeping. At 1:12 a.m., the clock started. Cell 7 smelled like concrete and cleaning solution and the particular exhaustion of people who had run out of options. There were 5 others inside. 2 men sleeping against the far wall. 1 woman pacing in short, tight loops near the drain. 1 teenager sitting on the floor with his knees to his chest. And 1 who sat perfectly still in the corner nearest the door, watching everything, saying nothing. Barbara chose the metal bench nearest the light. She sat with her back straight. Her mind ran through everything in order. She knew the law. She knew her rights. She knew that every minute she spent in this room was a minute the Dalton Network's courier was operating without surveillance. She knew that the window for tonight's confirmation, the staging location, the final piece, had already begun to close. She asked for a phone call at 1:20 a.m. The desk officer who came to the cell noted the request, looked at the name on the intake form, looked at the clock, and told her someone would follow up shortly. He did not come. At the same moment, on Garrison Road, Terence Galt was walking out of a freight building on the south end of the industrial strip, exchanging a handshake with a man Barbara had spent 4 months tracking. He climbed into a white panel van and drove north on Route 7 without a second look. The secondary staging location remained unconfirmed. Operation Steelgate had a fracture in it. Small, but the kind that, if left unaddressed, would require months to repair. Inside Cell 7, Barbara Ross did not panic. She had been trained not to panic. She was, if anything, the person in the room most equipped to process what was happening and determine the correct next step. But as the first hour became the second, a cold, organized anger began to settle beneath her professional calm. Not rage, not desperation, but the specific clarity of a woman who has kept meticulous records her entire career and understands, with absolute certainty, that everything happening in this building tonight will eventually be accounted for. Every name, every timestamp, every deliberate failure. At 2:44 a.m., Officer Simone Adler appeared at the cell for a welfare check. I am 26 years old. 8 months out of the academy. She scanned the cell with the careful attention of someone who still took the job seriously, and her eyes stopped on the woman sitting alone on the bench, composed, watchful, utterly out of place. Are you doing okay? Need anything? Yes, Barbara said. I need you to call the FBI's Southeast Field Division. The main line is 404-2-19-0. Tell them Special Agent Barbara Ross is being held at this facility and ask them to contact Deputy Director Marcus Webb immediately. Please make that call from this hallway, right now while I wait. Adler held her gaze for a long moment. There was something in the voice, not pleading, not erratic, the even, factual tone of someone reciting a procedure they have memorized. I'll pass it along, she said. I'm asking you to make the call yourself. You can verify my identity in 60 seconds. Adler nodded once, walked back down the corridor, and found Sergeant Price at his desk with a cup of coffee and a sports recap on his monitor. She told him what the woman in Cell 7 had said, repeated it word for word. Price looked at his coffee. If she's at the bureau, they'd already be calling us. She says her phone was taken as evidence. Then she'll get her call at 0600 with everybody else. Adler walked back to her rounds. She did not forget the conversation. She replayed it quietly for the rest of her shift, and later, when the investigation came, she would be the only person in Callaway County PD who emerged with her career, her record, and her conscience intact. Because unlike every other officer in that building between 1 o'clock and 7 a.m., she had done the one thing that mattered. She had tried. At 3:55 a.m., Captain Diane Yost arrived at the precinct for an early command shift. Yost was 49, a 17-year veteran, the kind of administrator who ran a tight paperwork operation and preferred her questions pre-answered before they reached her desk. When Price briefed her on the overnight arrests, including the woman in Cell 7 who had claimed federal status, Yost's response was immediate and instructive. Does she say anything specific? Keeps requesting a phone call. Says she's FBI. What are the charges? Suspicious activity, failure to comply, loitering. Yost picked up the overnight report, scanned it, set it down. Hold her until 0800. We'll run it up the chain in the morning. We'll run it up the chain in the morning. 7 words that would eventually cost Diane Yost her rank, her pension, and her freedom from a federal courtroom. At 4:19 a.m., Special Agent Barbara Ross had been in custody for 3 hours and 10 minutes. Somewhere in Callaway County, the evidence she needed was moving. The network she had spent 16 months dismantling piece by careful piece was operating without anyone watching it. And in the Callaway County PD Command Center, no one was asking the question that should have been obvious to everyone in the building since 1:07 a.m. Why does the woman in Cell 7 know exactly what she knows? They would get their answer at 7:02 a.m. They would spend the next 4 years wishing they had asked it sooner. She never raised her voice. She never had to. She simply remembered everything. Barbara Ross did not come from the kind of family that expected her to become a federal agent. She came from the kind of family that expected her to survive, which in Vine City, Atlanta in the early 1990s was already a significant task. Her mother, Claudette, worked dispatch for a private ambulance company for 22 years. Her father, Jerome, drove long-haul freight on a rotating schedule that kept him home roughly 11 days a month. Barbara was the oldest of 3. She learned early that authority was not something you waited for someone else to exercise. You either built it inside yourself or you went without it. She graduated from Spelman College in 2012 with a degree in criminal justice and a reputation among her professors as the student most likely to ask the question no one else in the room had thought to ask yet. She was accepted to the FBI Academy at Quantico on her first application. She finished in the top 8% of her cohort. Her evaluating supervisor wrote in her exit assessment, "Displays exceptional composure under simulated duress. Recommended without reservation." 9 years later, that assessment had proven conservative. Her first commendation came in 2017, after she spent 7 months undercover inside a fentanyl distribution chain running product between Macon and Augusta, a network that had been operating for 4 years without a single federal charge. Her second came in 2021. After she placed 3 principals of the Harlan Trafficking Consortium into federal custody using evidence she had gathered alone, over 11 months, without a single breach of her cover. Operation Steelgate was the third case, and it was the one that kept her awake even on the nights she wasn't surveilling anything. 16 months of work. 41 field contacts. 23 identified victims, men, women, and 4 minors, moving through the Dalton Network's pipeline at a pace the Bureau had been tracking but not yet stopped. The federal warrant was 72 hours from a judge's signature. The courier, Terrence Galt, had a confirmed handoff scheduled for tonight, the last piece of location intelligence the case needed before the Bureau could move. Everything Barbara had built for 16 months balanced on the next 4 hours going exactly as planned. The spotlight hit her car at 12:51 a.m. Brandon Brown had made 6 arrests in the past 30 days. 3 for DUI, 1 for domestic disturbance, 1 for possession, and 1 for an outstanding warrant on a man who had been on the county's radar for 2 years. He was, by the metrics his department used to measure such things, a productive officer. He showed up on time. He filed clean paperwork. He did not ask questions that complicated the shift. What Brandon Brown had never once done, in 6 years on the force, was arrest someone who outranked him by every measurable legal standard on American soil. He didn't know that yet, and later, the investigation would determine that even when he did know it, it hadn't mattered. He approached the driver's window with the practiced ease of a man who had already written the ending before he'd read the first line. Black woman. Alone. Past midnight. Industrial district. The story assembled itself in the 2 seconds it took him to cross from his cruiser to the Accord, and once Brandon Brown assembled a story, it held. Barbara spoke before he could issue his second command. Calmly. Precisely. Badge visible on her blazer, credentials extended through the open window, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who is rehearsed for situations far more dangerous than this one. He looked at the badge for 1 full second. Then he looked back at her. I don't care what that says. Step out of the vehicle. Those 7 words would later appear in 3 separate federal filings, 2 civil depositions, and a DOJ misconduct report that described them as, in the careful institutional language of investigators trained not to editorialize, demonstrative of deliberate disregard for established federal authority. What they actually were was simpler than that. They were the sound of a man choosing what he already believed over what was directly in front of him. The badge wasn't the problem. Barbara Ross wasn't a problem he needed to solve. She was a conclusion he had already reached, and everything she said from that point forward, her credentials, her case, her rank, her name, registered as interference. He opened the car door. She did not resist. She stepped out slowly, hands visible, still speaking in the same measured tone, still giving him every opportunity to stop. He did not stop. Officer Dale Merritt, positioned at the rear of the Accord, watched it happen and said nothing. That silence would cost him his badge too. The bench in cell 7 was cold in the way that institutional metal is always cold. Not from temperature alone, but from the accumulated indifference of every person who had ever designed, approved, installed, and ignored it. Barbara sat with her spine straight and her hands rested on her knees, and she began to do the only productive thing available to her in that room. She began to memorize. The desk officer who processed her booking was named T. Galvin, badge number visible, clipped slightly lower than regulation. He had logged her phone call request at 1:20 a.m. and initiated it without looking up. The officer who responded to her first request for a supervisor arrived at 1:34 a.m. and delivered the phrase "someone will be with you shortly" with the flat effect of a man reading from a script he had long since stopped hearing. A second officer came at 2:11 a.m., same phrase. Different faces. Neither had body camera footage that would later prove useful. The review board's technical report would describe both devices as having experienced intermittent recording interruptions during the relevant time frame. Intermittent, as though the cameras had simply been tired. This was not an accident of equipment. The DOJ investigation would eventually document a department-wide pattern spanning 9 years, body camera failures, lapses in footage, recording gaps that clustered with statistical improbability around use of force incidents and contested arrests. The cameras didn't malfunction randomly at Callaway County PD. They malfunctioned selectively. That distinction would matter enormously in federal court. Barbara knew none of this yet. What she knew was the cell, the clock, and the calculus of what was being lost. At 2:30 a.m., Terrence Galt loaded 2 duffel bags into the back of a white panel van on the south end of Garrison Road and drove to a transit hub 12 miles north of the county line. He boarded a bus at 3:10 a.m., the secondary staging location, the one piece of intelligence that would have completed the Bureau's warrant application, left with him. Operation Steelgate did not collapse that night, but it cracked. Barbara sat in cell 7 and waited with the patience of someone who understood, with complete clarity, that patience was the only thing in the room that still belonged to her. The FBI does not panic. That is not a cultural posture or an institutional affectation. It is a trained operational discipline that kicks in precisely when panic would be the natural response. What it replaces panic with is sequence. Step 1. Step 2. Step 3. And so on, with a methodical, gathering momentum that tends to accelerate as the picture clarifies. Deputy Director Marcus Webb ran the Southeast Field Division from a fourth-floor office in Atlanta's Peachtree Center complex. He had been in federal law enforcement for 23 years. He had supervised operations across 11 states. He was not a man who alarmed easily, and when Senior Agent Lydia Park appeared in his doorway at 5:40 a.m. and told him that Barbara Ross had missed 2 scheduled check-ins and her field beacon had gone dark somewhere on Garrison Road, he did not alarm. He started the sequence. By 6:10 a.m., the Bureau had confirmed the beacon's last recorded position, a 40-foot radius on the north end of the Garrison Road corridor, logged at 1:11 a.m. By 6:19 a.m., a data request to Callaway County PD's overnight intake system had returned a name. By 6:21 a.m., Marcus Webb was on the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He did not raise his voice during that call. He did not need to. At 6:44 a.m., 2 federal prosecutors joined Webb and Park in the building's underground garage. 3 black SUVs left the Peachtree Center at 6:47 a.m. They carried federal warrants, chain of custody documentation, and the kind of institutional authority that does not announce itself until the moment it is fully prepared to be irreversible. They arrived at Callaway County PD at 7:02 a.m. The desk sergeant on duty later told investigators that he had seen a lot of things come through the front doors of that precinct in 17 years of service. But he had never seen 3 black SUVs park in perfect formation, in silence, with their engines cutting at the exact same moment. He said it felt like weather. Marcus Webb walked through the front doors first. He carried a single manila folder. He did not introduce himself. The badge did that. Behind him, Lydia Park was already pulling out her recorder. Dana Osei had been doing investigative field work for the Bureau's Office of Professional Responsibility for 11 years, and she had a particular habit that her colleagues found either admirable or exhausting depending on the day. She looked up. Not metaphorically, literally. Whenever she arrived at an outdoor incident site, before she looked at the ground, the vehicles, the witness statements, or the chalk lines, she looked up and scanned the surrounding structures at eye level and above. Cameras, signage, angles, sight lines. Most investigators worked from the ground up. Dana worked from the outside in. She arrived at Garrison Road at 9:15 a.m., 3 hours after the Bureau had taken custody of Barbara Ross and 2 hours after Brandon Brown had been placed in a room with 2 federal prosecutors and a recording device. She stood at the north end of the corridor where the Accord had been parked, turned 360 degrees, and looked up. The sign above the shopfront at 414 Garrison Road read Callaway Dry Cleaning, same-day service. It was a narrow storefront, closed at that hour, with a faded yellow awning and a hand-lettered hour board taped to the inside of the glass door. Mounted above the awning, bolted directly into the brick fascia at a downward angle that gave it a clean, unobstructed view of the entire north end of the corridor, was a commercial-grade security camera. The kind that businesses install after a break-in and then forget about because it never needs maintenance and the footage uploads automatically to an off-site server every 24 hours. Dana called the owner at 9:22 a.m. She had the access credentials by 9:31 a.m. The footage was high definition, timestamped to the second, and completely uninterrupted from 11 p.m. the previous night through 7 a.m. that morning. It showed the Accord parked legally at the north end of the lot. It showed Brown's cruiser entering at 12:49 a.m. It showed the spotlight. It showed Barbara's hands on the steering wheel, visible and still. It showed the badge and credentials extended through the open window. It showed Brown looking at them directly for 1 full second before he said, and here the audio track, clean and uncompressed, left absolutely no interpretive room. I don't care what that says. It showed Merritt watching from the rear and saying nothing. It showed the names of the two supervisors whose voices appeared on Brown's radio during the arrest, both of whom had been briefed on the situation in real time and issued the same instruction. Keep going. Brandon Brown had filed his incident report at 1:45 a.m. It ran to 2 pages. The dry cleaning camera dismantled it in approximately 11 minutes of footage. Dana Osei watched the full recording once, made a backup copy, and called Marcus Webb. She did not need to summarize it. She just told him to sit down first. The complaint records for Callaway County PD were stored in a filing system that had not been digitized in any meaningful way since 2016, which the department had always described as a resource issue and which the DOJ investigation would later describe as a feature rather than a bug. Paper complaints, filed in manila folders, organized by year and then, loosely, inconsistently, by category, stacked in gray metal cabinets in a records room that smelled like humidity and toner and the particular staleness of documents no one was expected to retrieve. Forensic auditor Priya Solano and civil rights investigator Carlton Webb were given access to that room at 11:30 a.m. on the same morning the Bureau had walked through the front doors. They brought a flatbed scanner, 2 laptops, and enough coffee to last through whatever they were about to find. It took them 4 hours to understand the full shape of it. 47 misconduct complaints had been filed against Callaway County officers over the preceding decade. 44 of them had been closed without a formal investigation, not dismissed after review, not declined for insufficient evidence, but closed at intake, before the process that was supposed to evaluate them had been allowed to begin. The closure notations were brief and formulaic, the kind of language that is designed to satisfy a filing requirement without creating a record that could be examined later. 3 of the 47 complaints had been filed by black women in professional roles, a schoolteacher, a social worker, a registered nurse, each describing encounters with Callaway County officers that followed a pattern so consistent it read less like coincidence and more like policy. All 3 had been labeled unfounded within 48 hours of filing. None had been investigated. None of the women had been contacted for follow-up. In 2 of the 3 cases, the responding officer named in the complaint had received a satisfactory performance review within 60 days of the closure. Priya Solano set down her coffee at 3:47 p.m. and looked at Carlton Webb across the table of paper they had built between them. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The documents said it. They had been saying it for 10 years. No one in that building had ever been required to listen. The DOJ press statement went out at 4 p.m. on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the tip line the Bureau had opened as a procedural formality had received 22 calls. By the following Monday, 14 of those callers had been interviewed, their accounts documented, their complaints cross-referenced against the gray metal cabinets in the records room that Priya Solano and Carlton Webb had spent 4 hours excavating. 14 people who had filed complaints that went nowhere, or who had never filed at all because they had watched someone else try and understood correctly that trying cost something and paid nothing. The investigation did not widen so much as it exhaled, releasing, slowly, the pressure that a decade of suppression had built inside a department that had confused institutional loyalty with institutional integrity for so long that the two had become indistinguishable to the people running it. Mayor Gerald Tipton received the preliminary exposure assessment on a Tuesday afternoon in a meeting he had requested, believing it would be brief. It was not brief. The county attorney, Susan Marsh, sat beside him and did not speak for the first 12 minutes while the numbers were laid out in sequence. 17 officers with documented exposure to the federal misconduct findings. 2 captains named in the supervisory failures captured on the dry cleaning footage. 1 chief, Gerald Yates, 26 years on the job, 3 commendations, a plaque in the lobby, who had signed off on the complaint closure system that had buried 44 cases without review, and whose signature appeared on departmental policy memos that the DOJ had now classified as evidence. The settlement figure Susan Marsh put on the table was $8.7 million. Mayor Tipton asked if that number was negotiable. Marsh told him it was not the opening position. It was the floor. The liability would restructure Callaway County's municipal budget for the better part of a decade, deferring infrastructure projects, compressing department allocations, appearing as a line item in budget presentations for years after every officer involved had ceased to work in law enforcement. The dominoes did not fall dramatically. They fell the way institutional failures always fall, one careful, documented, irrefutable step at a time, each one making the next impossible to stop. The federal criminal proceedings against Brandon Brown opened on a Wednesday morning in the Northern District of Georgia with no protesters outside, no camera crews on the courthouse steps, and no particular ceremony beyond the routine business of a federal docket moving through its schedule. That absence of spectacle was, in its own way, appropriate. The case the government had assembled did not need drama. It was suffocating in its completeness. The charges were three: deprivation of civil rights under color of law, falsification of official records, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Each count carried its own documentation: the dry cleaning footage for the first, the 2-page incident report set against the time-stamped camera record for the second, the beacon removal and the evidence-bagged surveillance file for the third. The prosecutors did not grandstand. They sequenced. They built. They let the record speak in the same measured, irrefutable tone that Barbara Ross had used in Cell 7 at 2:44 a.m. when she gave Officer Adler the Bureau's phone number from memory. Brown's defense argued misidentification of intent. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Sergeant Kevin Price entered a guilty plea on a single count of dereliction of duty and received a suspended sentence, a permanent separation from law enforcement, and the quiet, administrative erasure of a career he had spent 21 years building. Captain Diane Yost was convicted on 2 counts of supervisory negligence and misconduct facilitation. She was sentenced, fined, and barred from holding any public office in the state of Georgia for life. Chief Gerald Yates resigned before the criminal referral reached him and spent the following 14 months in a legal negotiation that ended with a consent decree, a substantial personal fine, and a formal finding that his administrative conduct had enabled a sustained pattern of civil rights violations. Brandon Brown was sentenced on a Tuesday. The courtroom was quiet. The judge read the sentencing memorandum in full, which took 11 minutes, and then imposed 32 months in federal custody followed by 3 years of supervised release. He did not speak during the sentencing. Neither did the gallery. The only sound, when it was over, was the administrative click of a court reporter closing her transcript. 47 complaints. 11 minutes. 32 months. The arithmetic of accountability, arriving without fanfare, exactly as it should. Barbara Ross returned to active duty on a Monday morning, 43 days after she had been placed in Cell 7. She did not hold a press conference. She did not give an interview. She submitted her return-to-duty paperwork through the Bureau's standard HR portal, cleared her reinstatement physically, and walked back into the Southeast Field Division's 4th-floor offices carrying the same worn spiral notebook she had used for Operation Steelgate. The case had not died in her absence. It had fractured, reorganized, and continued the way federal investigations do when the people running them are professionals who understand that a setback is a variable, not a verdict. The secondary staging location that Terrence Galt had carried north on the 3:10 a.m. bus was identified 6 weeks later through a secondary informant whose cooperation Barbara had quietly cultivated in the final months of her cover work. The federal warrant was signed. The Dalton Network's principal operators were arrested across 4 counties in a coordinated operation that took 11 hours and produced 23 arrests, the same number as the potential victims Barbara had been counting since the investigation began. She testified at the federal trials that followed. Calmly, precisely, without a single case overturned. The settlement check arrived 4 months after Brown's sentencing. Barbara Ross deposited her share and spent the following 6 weeks in conversation with attorneys, advocates, and 7 of the 14 additional misconduct victims whose cases had surfaced during the DOJ investigation. What she built from those conversations was not a monument to what had happened to her. It was a mechanism designed to ensure it happened to fewer people after her. The Ross Initiative launched quietly, a legal defense fund, a rapid response network of attorneys and investigators, and an advocacy infrastructure specifically designed for Black women in professional roles who found themselves disbelieved, obstructed, or systematically failed by the institutions they worked within or alongside. Within 18 months of its founding, the initiative had provided legal support to 31 clients across 9 states. Barbara Ross did not describe what happened in Callaway County as the defining moment of her career. She described it as a data point, one she intended to make useful. She never raised her voice through any of it. She never had to. She simply remembered everything.